Urban agriculture, urban farming, or urban gardening is the practice of cultivating, processing, and distributing food in or around urban areas. It is used in both developing and developed countries, and some urban farmers call it a lifeline, as it provides food security in many countries, as well as having benefits to people's well-being and sense of community. However, there are serious issues surrounding urban farming that mean this is not a viable food production system. These include health hazards, carbon emissions, and ethical issues. In developing countries, urban agriculture is widely practiced in places like India, Vietnam, Cuba, Ghana, Uganda, and Kenya. 90% of fresh vegetables in Ghana's capital comes from production in the city. In Hanoi, 80% of fresh veg and 40% of eggs are produced by urban agriculture. It's a vital side earning for many households and often a means of survival. So the first argument against urban farming that I'll talk about is the health hazards that urban farming poses. So heavy metal contamination is a major concern in both developed and developing countries. In developing countries, clean water is often hard to find, and crops are often watered with wastewater. This saves on expensive fertilizers, but if untreated can contain disease-carrying pathogens. Poor management of compost piles increases diseases such as bronchitis, tuberculosis, dysentery, and cancer, which is caused by waste gases. Lead in the soil and air can be a major contaminant that leafy vegetables can concentrate in their leaves. In many developing countries, urban agriculture is actually illegal. In places like Korea, it isn't technically illegal, but authorities use other laws such as environmental and habitat laws to act against the cultivators. Police guards come and slash the crops, and theft of the crops is quite common. This is problematic, obviously, in many ways, but it has a negative environmental impact. Because cultivation is seen as short-term, this can be detrimental to the land. Cultivators use chemical fertilizers to enhance the output and to get more quicker, and this reduces the ecological biodiversity of the land. There's little incentive for farmers to invest in soil, so it becomes impoverished, and erosion causes problems such as silting. In developed countries, urban farming often takes place in rehabilitated industrial areas with historical soil contamination. This includes places in the USA, and they're known as brownfields, and the soil has been found to contain heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides, asbestos, petroleum products, and solvents. Cleaning up the land is expensive, and in impoverished areas, people have no choice but to grow produce here and be exposed to the contaminated soils. In places like Japan, there's been an increase in proximity of agricultural lands to residential areas, which increases the human exposure to agrochemicals. For example, an agricultural community in Tokyo found aerosols of organophosphate pesticide infiltrated their homes. And the surface runoff from agricultural pesticides has also contributed to the degradation of water quality and increased toxicity to aquatic organisms. Japan has a long history of metal mining and factory work. This has led to a prevalence of cadmium contamination, which leads to the Itai disease, which is chronic cadmium poisoning. A link was made between locally grown rice irrigated with cadmium-contaminated river water from the Kamioka copper mine. Rice is almost exclusively the source of cadmium intake, yet rice is encouraged to be grown as a national food produce. Taking advantage of unused urban areas, such as roadsides, may seem an inefficient use of space. However, the accumulation of trace metals in vegetables grown near roads is significantly higher than in rural areas because of traffic-related contaminants in the air. These pose a risk of hazard to human health, such as cancer incidence and mortality. So there's the argument that buying local from urban farms produces food miles and produces fewer emissions. However, in some circumstances, urban farming could actually lead to an increase in emissions, as additional energy and fertiliser inputs are needed to grow produce in unfavourable environments. There's quite a well-known example of tomatoes grown in Spain and imported to the UK use fewer emissions than those grown in greenhouses in the UK. Weber and Matthew in 2008 reported that buying local has a negligible effect on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. While it might be nice to buy local, it can also hurt the poorest suppliers in the least developed and developing countries that rely heavily on revenue from exported products to countries such as ours. Livelihoods are literally at stake. Fresh fruit and vegetable trade in the UK supports 1 million people living in Africa, according to Zeno. Developing advocates argue emissions relating to food imports from poor nations are manageable and aren't necessarily larger than those grown locally. So to conclude, urban farming does contribute to food stability, and for many people it is a means of survival. It also has benefits to people's well-being from being involved in nature and growing their own food. However, the risk cannot be ignored. Urban farming causes health hazards because the land being farmed is ultimately not suitable for food production. Urban farming can cause more harm to people depending on it for survival, as well as the land itself being damaged through cultivation. In developed countries, we may think that growing and buying local is doing our bit for the environment. This is not always the case. Food miles are not the only source of carbon emissions, and denying people in developing countries the imports that they rely on is ethically questionable.